good morning and happy Friday to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2020 Supply Chain Conference that's hosted by UW-Milwaukee's Supply Chain Management Institute and the Connected Systems Institute. And thank you for attending this particular session that is cyber risk and supply chain manufacturing partners and suppliers, or suppliers and partners. My name is Yella Trask, and I am with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And in my role at WEDC, I support our manufacturing sector and work very closely with our academic partners and industry, and really looking at supporting how talent development and technology implementation intersect. And with that, the Connected Systems Institute and Supply Chain Management Institute really embody that intersection of academia and industry working together to really help our manufacturing sector and our economy move forward. And it's particularly why I'm excited about this session, because oftentimes when you're talking to particularly smaller and mid-sized manufacturers and thinking about technology implementation, oftentimes there isn't as much attention being paid to the cyber risk environment. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Charlene Deaver-Vazquez with FISMAX. Welcome, Charlene. I'm gonna read through her bio to make sure I don't miss anything. Charlene is a cyber risk consultant with over 30 years of IT and security related experience. Founded in 2014, her firm has provided cybersecurity services for the Department of Labor, Defense Information Systems Agency, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So 2 years ago, she began developing probabilistic risk models. See, I knew I was going to trip over that.
You did fine.
For nuclear regulatory. By mid-2021, her firm released the probabilistic risk modeling for cyber framework. It has a variety of models and methods, several of which can be applied to organizational risks, such as supply chain risk. And oftentimes that's the question: what's my risk, what's my return, and how do I make sense of the investment? When she's not working, she spends her time with her husband and family, cooking and enjoying life, as we all should be doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlene. And the way that we're going to run things is Charlene will present, and then we will reserve some time at the end for Q&A. Thank you. And Charlene, take it away.
Well, I just want to say thank you for that introduction. What I want to share with you today is some information about cyber risk, what we're seeing in the industries, again, specifically for supply chain. I want to take a look at this from the viewpoint of manufacturers, suppliers, and partners. And there we go. And so I have a good deal of information I want to share with you. I first want to talk about some statistics. I want to talk about a few attacks, not a lot, but a few attacks that I think are very good examples of some outcomes. And then I also want to share some information about best practices, and I'll try and do the statistics and attacks for each of the three areas, manufacturers, supplies, and partners, because they're very different. For when it comes to supply, security, cybersecurity, and the attacks, we're seeing some very different things in each of these areas, so I kind of want to break them out. And then I want to talk about how to quantify the risk, because that's kind of what I do. And unless you quantify the risk and make it relevant to the organization, oftentimes the discussions around cybersecurity can just be a lot of bad news. So I think that part is very important. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So supply chain risk can impact a product or a service at any stage in development, even in the earliest stages of developing ideas and playing the what if game that an organization might want to consider expanding into a new market. Literally from beginning to end, there's risk at every stage. Some of you may be familiar with the NIST supply chain risk management. I've got the link on the slide. This is the government's guidance for supply chain risk management. Some organizations outside of the government adopted. I thought it was a useful resource, so I've just shared it there. So let's start talking about what's the risk. When we look at these three targets, and I'm going to call them targets for my purposes, manufacturing, supply, and partners, we see that the types of attacks we're seeing can be very different across them. In manufacturing, we typically see things targeted against the automation process. In suppliers, we're seeing more things related to counterfeit of products. And when we say products, we're not just talking about hardware, we're seeing more and more of the software, services being consumed from the cloud, software development, code, a lot of these kinds of things. And then when we talk about partners, we're talking about our trusted partners. And here, the biggest risk is in the communication that occurs. So in my industry, we use the word attack surface, but really what we're talking about is how is it that the attackers are gaining entry into the environment. So I'm going to break this into two areas, external and internal. For the external, we look at things like the data pathways. What is the data flow in and out of the organization? What are the ports? What are the protocols that are being used? Who's the communication with? Is it encrypted? Is it not encrypted? We also look at APIs. These are application programming interfaces. So any of the internet-facing cloud applications that you have, those APIs, how they communicate, what data they bring in, how they process it internal to the system. These are where we find a lot of attack occurring. And also in here is email. The email that comes into the organization, in fact, cyber crimes use email delivery quite frequently, and that's because social engineering always works. And all they have to do is get you to click on a link, and then the attack can begin. So moving from external, let's start looking at the internal. And this is something that operations folks tend to pay a lot of attention to, but otherwise, organizations tend not to really focus on the internal risk. And so the very first thing I have up here for the internal risk is people. I'm going to show you some statistics as we go through here that will help demonstrate how large that risk is. So some of the things you can do, we just talked about email, educating people, having cyber awareness in your organizations, not only around the what not to do, how to keep the organizational safe, but also in response to incidents and just having a good awareness program. The more that we see, do, and hear things, the more we internalize, and the more we will be able to respond when something happens. So I really can't say enough about the people aspect. The other thing we have in internal is system vulnerabilities. Now, your operations folks will be paying a lot of attention to this as a normal course of business. And then we also have architecture. So if you have a very flat architecture inside, then you are far more open to vulnerabilities and attacks being able to move laterally. So how your networks, how your organizations are constructed and how they connect to one another has a lot to do with the risk. Some of the impacts from attacks, and this is just a short list, but things like disruption, data exposure or exfiltration, which is very common, destruction, which is actually on the rise, ransomware, we're seeing a lot of ransomware, and that will continue to increase for a number of reasons. Also, you have financial cost impacts, and we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of financial cost. And then reputation, which is always a negative impact from a cyber breach. So, but these are just some of the impacts. When we look at the kinds of attacks and we start matching it up with attackers, we see some interesting statistics come out. Some things like disruption can be put in the category of a hacktivist. Data exposure or exfiltration, we tend to think of a nation state. Some people will realize the risk of nation state attacks against American businesses. There was a statistic, a study put out last year that for the first time, organizations were beginning to recognize nation state as a risk to them, not just to the states themselves, but literally to their own businesses. And that is a risk. It has been a risk for a long time. So it's very reassuring to see that that is now being recognized. When we look at destruction, think insider threat. And this is where we go back to looking at the landscape, external and internal, and having people at the top of that list. the insider threat is really quite substantial, more so than I think most organizations recognize. And the insider threat can be purposeful. It can be data exfiltration. It can be a disgruntled employee, but a large percentage of these are just accidents, misconfigured items, right? And then the last one we have on here is ransomware. And for that, we think of the criminal attackers, which are on the rise, unfortunately. So let's start breaking this down by each of our target areas. We'll start with manufacturing first. The next couple of slides, I have Deloitte listed here. They were the source for some of these statistics and the trends that we're beginning to see. So for manufacturing, investments in smart manufacturing is expected to rise, taking a greater share of budgets. If you have the ability to quantify the risk associated, this would help inform leadership decisions. And as we go through the next couple of slides, I found it very interesting, this initial statement about investing in smart manufacturing being on the rise. The next statistic we have is that 85% of the surveyed manufacturers agreed that it's important to work with outside partners and vendors and other companies to fully realize their smart manufacturing and digital goals. So on one hand, this makes a great deal of sense, but with this, we have a tremendous increase in risk. In fact, an analysis of Fortune 500 manufacturers identified that companies with more than 15 strategic alliances registered twice the revenue growth, twice. That's substantial. So as we see businesses spend more money engaging with more partners and more strategic alliances, and there's more automation, we're going to continue to see a substantial increase in risk. Think of it this way: every connection has a risk to it. Every communication brings a risk to it. Now, let's talk about some of the attacks. Some of the top concerns in the different kinds of attacks circle around the theft of intellectual property or the operation closures, where you have actual shutdowns, productivity stops. Some of the attack sources, and this slide really kind of got my attention, and I really want to make sure that you kind of absorb this. 75% of attacks involve external forces. Internal threats account for the remainder. That's 25%. So often organizations will not really take the insider threat as serious as they should. When we look at the cyber risk to an organization and something like manufacturing, we often think, oh, it's an external, and I've got my perimeter control, and that's really going to protect me. But attackers are very good at figuring out ways to get around whatever protections we put up. Email is heavily used because it works. The best statistics we get are that if you have an organization that practices cyber awareness and practices email attacks, the best that you can get is a 5% click-through rate. And that may sound really small. Well, only 5% of the people are likely to click on that. It only takes one click for that to work. And on the insider threat, that's really quite substantial. There are a number of attacks that have been happening, and it either comes from misconfiguration, which is again an insider threat. We count that on the insider threat. It's a disgruntled employee. And so there are things that we can do on both fronts, from best practices on perimeter defense, adopting a very good cybersecurity program implementation for the elimination of the external, but there's a lot that can be done to close down that potential 25% risk that's sitting on the inside. And those are things that organizations can pick up and do and focus on that really, for very little input, have a great return in reducing the risk. 50% of companies reported having experienced a data breach or a cyber attack in the previous 12 months. This is a pretty staggering statistic. So when we look across other industries, Each industry experiences cyber attacks differently for different reasons. Supply chain is one that is on the rise and will continue to rise. So the fact that we're seeing 50% of companies having data breaches in the last 12 months should really get your attention, and I want it to get your attention. There are a lot of things that can be done, but then again, there are some things that you really can't ever prevent it. And we're going to talk about some of those. Some of the recent attacks that have been happening in the supply chain and the ramifications that come from that. So part of this is focusing on understanding the landscape of what's happening, understanding that the risk is increasing. There are some things you can do to help yourself reduce some of the internal risks, but some of these risks are not easy to mitigate. Instead, you should be focused on response preparations and having these conversations about risk in the leadership upper echelons at boards, your CIOs, CISOs. You should be having these conversations at that level. So if you can quantify the risk, if you can turn it into, hey, there's a lot of bad news, into something that is relevant to the organization, then you can start making smart decisions about what to do to respond and where to focus the limited resources that you have. Let's talk a little bit about some of the top attacks that we've seen in manufacturing. This first example is a little out of date, but I think it's still relevant. As an insider threat attack, this was at DuPont. Gary Min was a research chemist. After he resigned, it was found that he had downloaded 22,000 abstracts and over 16,000 documents. The fair market value was 400 million. That's an example of an insider threat. Sometimes you know about them and you find them, sometimes you don't. This one is for the FACC. It's an Australian airplane component manufacturer. In 2016, their attack was targeted their accounting department, and it resulted in 55.8 million in losses. They fired and then sued the CEO and the CFO for $11 million for failure to protect the company from attack. These are consequences. That one I think should really resonate, and the focus on what can be done really is super important. And like I said, one of the first resources I gave you on NIST, deciding what standards you will apply in your organization and how stringent you will be, and building in that organizational view of risk from top to bottom really goes a long way to protecting these kinds of things. This one is the Mondelez. It's a multinational food and beverage company. NotPetya is the name of the attack that they experienced. And this destroyed servers, 17,000 servers, 24,000 laptops, and production facilities globally. The cost there was 100 million. NotPetya hit many organizations. Maersk was hit, FedEx was hit, 76 ports and 800 vessels were impacted. So cyber attacks can be just staggeringly impactful, and often across an entire industry. And then it just kind of snowballs from there, and there's all this additional damage that occurs that just kind of flows down and crosses multiple industries. Some of the costs of cyber attacks. So cybercrime, what we're finding is that some cybercrime groups have been using ransomware as a smokescreen for cyber attacks designed to steal intellectual property. So it's bad enough that we have the ransomware attack, but again, that's kind of a smokescreen. And we're seeing the more that we learn, the more research is done, the more that we learn, and the more that cybercrime increases, the more that we're seeing statistics like this come out, that it's actually being used as a smokescreen for something else. And some of these behaviors, they're unique to supply chain. We're not seeing these kinds of behaviors in other industries, but we are seeing them in supply chain. Incidents can take production offline. That was one of the two biggest concerns that we looked at when we're talking about impacts to this. So in this particular survey, 500 IT and operations workers found that 61% of the companies experienced cybersecurity incidents, and they were affecting factories. 3/4 of those took production offline. So the impacts can be substantial. So now let's switch and talk a little bit about suppliers. Their situation is different. Cyber attacks here focus on code. So the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, and periodically they come up with some really good reports. They're a resource I like to look at. They found that 66% of the attacks focused on the supplier's code. This was from July of 2021, so this was this year. Earlier this year, there was another statistic talking about supply chain attacks that said there was a 4-fold increase in 1 quarter. So as we've seen in some of these statistics, the increase in supply chain attacks is almost exponential. And there are a lot of things driving that, and there are no real good mitigations around that to lower that at this point. Also, the first slide that I put up, we talked about hardware and software combinations. The more that people and suppliers, again, manufacturers want to have more automation. They want to have more strategic partners. There's a great movement going into the cloud. You've got more code, more APIs. These are all more attack points. The attack surface is increasing as we see this transition. The supply chain itself is really an ecosystem. So you have multiple resources that are needed to design, manufacture, distribute a product. In cybersecurity, our view of this, we're looking at hardware, software, cloud, local storage, and distribution mechanisms. So when a hacker looks at this, and you kind of want to think that way, that when a hacker begins to look at this, I want to execute an attack, I want to pick a target, I'm thinking my way through what I want to do here, they'll look at all of these things. They'll go for the low-hanging fruit first, things like email. They'll look at the internet-facing APIs, anything where there is a form online, an application server online. All of these components are available and open to them. They will then look at cloud, and then once they can get into an organization, then they'll start looking for local storage and any of the distribution mechanisms. We are so automated. We have computers talking to computers, and all of these data flows are all entry points. Good cyber practices don't prevent the downstream attacks. An organization can be vulnerable even if its own defenses are quite good. Attackers explore ways to infiltrate an organization by targeting the suppliers, and these attacks are becoming increasingly common. So there's two ways to look at this, from the attack surface and how you can minimize the attack surface, things that you can do to close the doors and windows so that they don't have an opportunity to get in. And then in this slide, we start to open up the view of the targets that they're going after. They're using the suppliers to get to the end target. And we've seen that over and over again, and that will continue. So it makes the suppliers targets, not just because of what they're doing in their business, but they're leveraging them to get somewhere else. So some of the tactics that are used, multiple attacks on suppliers are often part of a larger attack on one of their customers, which is the final target. These attacks can go undetected for long periods of time, and they use techniques like advanced persistent threat, or APTs. They're complex, well-planned, and sophisticated. So I want to take a couple of minutes here and talk about this. So if you don't know what an advanced persistent threat is, these began by hostile nations. So if we went back a few years in time, just recent, The most sophisticated attacks we saw were from nation states. Every nation, the US participates, we all do. Wars are not just fought on physical battlegrounds, it's all moved into cyber. And nation states will find 0 days or vulnerabilities in an operating system at its very core, or hardware vulnerabilities. They'll keep these in their back pocket, and that becomes part of the ongoing battle nation to nation. And so this term, advanced persistent threat, kind of evolved from that because it described these early attacks. They were extremely advanced and very sophisticated. Typical hackers didn't have this capability at all. In fact, they often used well-developed tool sets, very specific. And then the attacks were able to gain entry, move laterally through the organization, and they would just reside there. As a hostile nation, you're talking about spying. They just want to sit quietly and observe. So they would last in an organization 1, 2, or 3 years before they were ever discovered. And so that's where this term advanced persistent threat came from. But what we're seeing, and again in supply chain, is that these kinds of tactics are being used by criminal now. The criminal element has really matured and moved from not being as sophisticated to being a full functioning business with distribution capability and affiliates that they hire, and then products, those items that data that is stolen is sold on the dark web. It's fully formed. Their capabilities are very much now like nation states were just a few years ago. So let's talk about some of the attacks in this category. SolarWinds, you probably have heard about this in the news. You might not have, but SolarWinds is a manufacturer of security products, and they were attacked. The attackers gained access in September of 2019. They tested the initial malicious code in October. They injected it in February of 2020. And then SolarWinds, not knowing that this had happened, sent the hacked updates to their clients. It was a data push out. They were updating their product. That was phase 1 of what we know now about the SolarWinds attack. It was just recently reported that just since May of this year, 140 of those downstream client organizations were targeted, 14 of them were compromised. This is after everyone was aware of the mitigations and patches and everything had been put in place. So this is what I'm trying to explain in the complexity level and the way that attackers can obfuscate their end game goal. We really don't know yet as an industry what the primary end target of the SolarWinds attack is, but this is a supply chain attack. It was through an update of software. Now, SolarWinds took a lot of people by surprise, but it wasn't the first time that this had happened. In fact, there was I think it was a tax business that had software, and their update, very similar to this, was also hacked, and that pushed out. But it didn't happen in America, so it was kind of not really focused on, and people, didn't really pay much attention to it. But that was a precursor to this attack. There are other attacks that are precursors to this one that are also supply chain and update, and those happened on your smartphone. So on smartphone, applications would be put into the marketplace, and they were completely legitimate. After they had been downloaded to the phone, attackers would then go to the organization, compromise the update. So the next update that you got, not through the online marketplace, but directly from the app manufacturer, installed malware. So we had precursors in the industry, but we weren't paying attention to them. Does that make sense? And they moved from platform to platform. And we're seeing that kind of trend now more and more frequently. as cybercrime matures, they get very adept at pivoting. They will target one type of attack against one industry, and within a week, they'll change the attack that they're delivering, and they'll change industry, and now they'll target this segment. So it's very sophisticated, very hard to identify and kind of get ahead of. So what's the analysis just from this one attack? Beyond the extensive dwell time, successful penetration of Microsoft and government networks, the purpose of SolarWinds attack is still unknown, but there is speculation that the primary target was the US government, and everything else, 400 out of the world's Fortune 500, were collateral damage. Federal investigations indicate the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service was behind this. Now let's talk a little bit about partners. When we talk about partners, we're talking about those that we do business with that we trust. They're trusted. They're in that special category. They can be contractors, subcontractors, they can be fulfillment agents or partner organizations that we treat as though they're part of our organization. So the problem here is the trust part. It's difficult to know a partner's security posture, practices, and so forth. It's really hard to have that open communication and visibility between two organizations. It's just not a natural sort of thing that happens. So you can have regulatory requirements and you can have shared assessment reports, but that really doesn't give you the deep, deep view of risk from that partner. So that's why we say trust and verify. The best advice here is start now to be moving towards a zero trust construct. And what zero trust means is that every connection is verified. Right now we trust connections, and once they're established, you have some perimeter defense around that, but you then kind of let it go because it's trusted. They're like part of your organization, and so there's this level of trust. Attackers leverage this trust through the connections. So that's why you'll hear in the industry, if you haven't been exposed to it already, a great deal of conversation around the zero trust construct. And that's going to be one of the best defenses against this kind of problem. So third-party data breaches, these have kind of an unexpected outcome that I wanted to highlight here because of the increased nature, and we are seeing these massive data breaches and massive extraction of personal information and credit card information and so forth. But there's this unexpected consequence that your organization might have to respond to an incident that was outside of your control, outside of your organization, and it's this indirect collateral damage that we're beginning to see adds, again, more complexity to this, and is just something to really kind of be aware of as you plan for responses to cyber attacks, as you plan for mitigations that you will put in place. You should consider this as something that you might well have to respond to. As more organizations are connected, the data continues to flow past multiple boundaries, and then it can become a question who owns the data as it's transferred from location to location. And this is an area that's begun to get a lot more attention because organizations are now having to deal with these unexpected consequences. So now let's talk a little bit about best practices. And really kind of, I have one best practice, which is map your data flows. And then from that, there are some additional things that go around this, because in order to understand what the risk is so that you can mitigate the risk, you have to understand, fully understand the architecture and the landscape. What is that attack surface that you have? And this is probably the hardest step in the entire process. So as I say, map your data flows, that's beginning to understand how everything is interconnected. What are all the communications that occur? What data is traversing where? And in this kind of a structure that I want to give you. So prioritizing data governance to the top of leadership's kind of radar, what you're paying attention to. Implementing mechanisms for tracking data and both digital and physical forms. Enforcing ownership, who's responsible, accountability, assigning data custodians within your organization. If you don't already have that, that becomes very important. Implementing system level control. So now we're talking about what standards you are adopting. And then monitoring and enforcing security policies and handling procedures and auditing. So I know there's a lot on this slide. We'll kind of break this down a little bit more. And I want to kind of show you how this should flow across the organization. So that's my little triangle there is the organizational diagram, leadership at the top, operations hands-on down at the bottom. So this has to flow from the organization from the top down. Having this understanding, number one, that cyber is business risk. It's not something separate. It's not a maintenance process that operations is responsible for. The more that organizations keep that out-of-date perspective on cyber risk, the more that they will continue to be victims of cyber crime and cyber attacks. So the first thing is in prioritizing data governance, understanding cyber risk is business risk. Can you think of one aspect in business that you do now, especially in supply chain, one aspect that doesn't have a cyber component? So the systems that support it, the data flows that come in and out of that process, even if it's a human physical process, all of that is related. Cyber and the business are the same. So prioritizing data governance at the top. Mechanisms for tracking data. In Department of Defense, they have this old process and they call it ports and protocols. So when you're tracking data, it's not just about the movement of the product tracking, but it's the data flow and the communication links from device to device. Is the communication encrypted? Have you been able to confirm that the data you're receiving is actually from the system you think it's coming from? It's this kind of work. Mapping that out is, as I said before, one of the most difficult pieces of the entire process. But if you don't have that, then you really don't have good visibility into it, and you're never going to get it really under control. So as difficult as that part is, it's worth every penny and every moment and every resource that you put into getting that part done. And then enforcing ownership and accountability. You really can't get your arms around something like this until you've got ownership and accountability. And that needs to flow in the business construct, not just cyber is separate. It needs to flow within the business. This responsibility of data, understanding where it's coming from, understanding what that architecture looks like. And then at the very bottom is where we have the detail items that really are in the hands of operations. And those are the system controls and the policies for handling and auditing. So now that we've kind of talked about the risk across the three areas, let's take a quick look at how to quantify the risk. And I'll go through this kind of quickly to leave some time for questions at the end. So when we say quantifying the risk, and we say using probabilistic methods, what we're talking about is taking much of what information I've just shared with you and turning it into numerical expressions. So if we can't quantify the risk, all we can do is say, hey boss, it's a lot of bad stuff happening and we've seen a dramatic increase and things are going to get worse. But when you quantify it, you move from a qualitative description that I've just given you to something that is a numeric expression. In the same way that we look at the forecast for weather, these types of models and quantifying the risk are the same type of forecast of risk based on the data that we have available. Does that make sense? That's what we're going to be talking about. So to this, we add not just quantifying it, put it in numerical expressions, but then we add the impact, because until you add the impact, how is that relevant to the organization? Management can't really make a decision on that. So let me show you an example. Based on the current data, we estimate between 35 to 54% probability of an event in the next 6 months causing a disruption to production at a financial cost of between $130,000 to $300,000. This is risk quantified. So there are a couple of things I want to break down in here. We said first, it's based on the current data. When you quantify risk, it's a moment in time. Events will occur and that risk will change. So it's always something that's kind of a moment on time. It's based on the current data that you have available. Risk is always a range. And then to this, we had tied impacts. We gave a time frame for the expectation. It was going to disrupt production, so we know what it's going to do. It makes it relevant to leadership. If leadership can't understand what that risk is, and if they can't generally associate a financial cost to that, they still don't know what to do about the information. So that's why the risk quantification, after I've given you all of this statistics and trends and issues, why I wanted to share this piece as well. Because this, I think, is where a lot of the cyber security conversations kind of stop and they don't do this last piece. So risk is a range. It's your worst case, your best case, and the most likely case. We use probabilistic methods, and they can be used even when you have very little data. In fact, generally, reporting on cybersecurity trends looks at the historical data. These probabilistic methods are looking forward, what you can expect. You don't always have to have the historical data. In fact, if you have very little information, probabilistic methods will give you the answer you're looking for. And estimates are always validated by observations in time. As things go forward, is your estimate still valued, or do you need to update it? So some of the keys in a quantifying risk, most organizations want to see the financial impact. You really have to have the processes mapped out, and it's a team approach. So if I were looking at a financial impact, for example, I might start with the process or product. I would then be able to estimate the likelihood of attack, and you could do this on a particular type of attack, categories of attacks. And then you estimate the two costs that we said we were going to talk about. Primary and secondary is how we generally break this down. The primary cost is the cost to the organization. Secondary is the cost of responding to other people's impact by what happened to my organization. So it might be responding to client issues, calls, credit report services might be offered in some cases. Those are the secondary costs. If I'm looking to map my processes, I would start by mapping the entire supply chain or focus on one key area at a time, work through one at a time, and that would be an easier way to tackle it. Give yourself a plan, what you'll do this quarter, next quarter, the next quarter in order to get this done. So once you've identified the area you want to focus on, then you'll do the analysis of the risk. From that, you want to identify what mitigations. You're starting to make decisions based on what you evaluated. And then you want to quantify that worst case scenario. I know we all want to look at the best case, look at the worst case. On your team, you'll have a number of people here. You'll have supply chain management. You should have this in your organization's operations, logistics, legal, you're going to need them. Product development, bring them into the fold. Procurement, you've got to talk to them, and senior management has got to be at the table. When we quantify the risk, you can do this from several perspectives, several viewpoints for quantifying it. You can look at the control strength of your perimeter. That's what we mean by control, the control strength, what securities you put in place. You can do it by attack modeling. I could have a whole other conversation on attack modeling. But you can look at it from a particular attack. When you see attacks occurring in the industry, especially if they're in your industry, model that attack so you can begin to understand what's the likelihood I'm going to be hit by that attack. You can do scenario-based modeling, which is very collaborative. Bring your team in, you have conversations around it, and scenario modeling. So you can come up with multiple scenarios to take a look at. You can also do tabletop exercises, which are very useful. Traditionally, we see these in response to an incident. We'll see it, but you can use tabletop exercises in other ways. And then also estimating the financial impact, of course. So very quickly, I'll show you some of the probabilistic methods that are used, and then we'll go to the Q&A session. So these are mathematical models for analysis. They use well-established processes. You will find these same methods used in safety, like nuclear space and others. You'll see it in epidemiology. It's found in finance, seismic, weather forecasting. Again, these are all predictions. They're all probabilistic methods. This is one formula I'm going to give you. This is one of my favorites. People will ask, what is the equation for risk? Threat times likelihood is risk. It's based on a Bayesian formula. That's the one at the bottom there, the P and the A and all of that. Yeah. What it basically says is I have one circle that is my threat data set, and I have my likelihood. Where these two overlap, that's the definition of risk. So you can take this very complex mathematical formula and you can just say threat times likelihood, and it's a probabilistic model. Another one that's used a lot of areas is called a Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo runs 1,000 simulations or more. When you give your estimate, we said worst, most likely, and best, within that range, mathematically, it will give you predictions for 1,000 scenarios of what will actually occur within that range. And they're extremely accurate, and they're used, well established and used in multiple industries. This is what the outcome of the Monte Carlo looks like, the probability distribution. And there are multiple kinds of probability distributions used for different purposes. But basically, they will be this bell-shaped curve, and they're showing you the probability of risk at each area. This is also a nice one to use for presentation. So with that, I'll open it up to questions if we have any.
So feel free to drop in your questions into the Q&A while we wait to see if we're going to get any. I do have one or two myself, Charlene, to kind of kick us off.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you put that back up there. The broad kind of a general question. Recently, just the other day, there was a report released here in Wisconsin that surveyed over 400 manufacturers. And there were several questions related to cyber. As we work with particularly smaller mid-sized manufacturers and in our defense supply chain, really concerned about elevating their awareness. So how do we get them to realize that this is really important, and your point around cyber risk is business risk? Part of the survey revealed that 81% of them feel pretty confident about their cyber plans, which, when you look at the fact that on the qualitative side, there were a lot of statements around hope. We hope nothing happens. We hope, and in that kind of profile of the smaller mid-size, they are oftentimes outsourcing their IT and cyber. So any advice on how to continue to just keep raising the awareness of how critical cyber is in business planning?
Yes. Having that conversation can be difficult. It was only maybe in the last 2 years that the data we were getting back about organizational perspective on risk started to shift. Right, so it took quite a lot for organizations to start having that shift, for senior leadership to begin to want to acknowledge how substantial the risk is. So changing that and elevating that is an ongoing struggle that you will have within your organization. So my advice is, if you're in an organization, you want to elevate this discussion. Many of the statistics that we see in the industry are very useful. And having that conversation, look within your organization for where there are opportunities to present some of the shared case studies Those also seem to resonate well with leadership. If it's always about, the attack part of it, they're not going to pay much attention, because until you can quantify and make it relevant to them, it's just background noise. They don't get it. And they know that their operations people are doing everything that they can. And that's something else. And that's why I had that slide there. Organizations can do everything that they can in their power, provide, best practices, have a mature security model, and they're still open to attack. And the supply chain has become this magnet, because when you have good perimeter defense, you have good practices internally, you have good awareness, they look for other ways into the organization, and supply chain has become that conduit that they are gravitating to because it works. So it can be a struggle. What we do find, though, is whenever an incident occurs, there will be a peak of awareness that comes that lasts for a short period of time before it goes away. So you have to look for those opportunities when the conversation is there, and then be ready to engage leadership, have your facts, have your figures, have, whatever your recommendations or your thoughts are. And then when you can get them to engage, you want to have a plan that has sufficient time, that it's easy to implement, and they can see progress over time.
Great.
I hope that answered
Yeah,
that.
that was very helpful. And your point on supply chain, that's really where there is the push and pull, right? From the larger manufacturers needing to recognize that their supply chains are points of vulnerability. And likewise, suppliers, if they're not waking up to the reality, are needing to understand that in order to keep a customer, they're going to have to address their cyber. So maybe that push and pull is where it's going to come together. We do have another question from the participants. What type of risks are the most common on the OT side of an organization?
So I assume you're talking about the operational side of the house.
Yes.
And moving away from what we think of as the IT infrastructure. So I think the best way to answer that is to pivot from manufacturing and instead look towards the risks that we're seeing around industrial controls, and to take it from kind of looking at that perspective. So the risks are substantial in that area. It's going to be more about trying to take services offline, right? And it's not going to be trying to exfiltrate data, and those are going to be even more sophisticated in order to get into those systems, and they will be more long-term. And as I said, the risks there is going to be more destructive in taking things offline, especially if you are something critical to the US, and they see you as a competitor. That's a different, I appreciate the question. That's very different. And in many ways can be, I would consider it more consequential, more severe.
Right, and related to that is a question around considering that the combination of IT and OT cybersecurity seems to be a significant impediment to the adoption of these advanced technologies. Mm-hmm. The more you add, the more you connect these technologies, the more risk there is and exposure. How would a company manage that adoption risk? Is it really thinking about what you laid out as the modeling ahead of time to really know kind of what you're wading into? If you could speak to that.
Yes, and you've already answered the question for me.
Oh, sorry.
You did a great job.
I was listening very closely.
Larger organizations already have this capability, and they're already applying it. And so it's the mid-size and the small organizations that aren't really up to speed on this yet. And yes, it is about being able to model the risk of adopting the technology in the same way that a business would weigh the risks of expanding into a new market. It's exactly the same. In our industry, cyber, we haven't thought about it this way. Historically, everything has been compliance and standards and all of these things. Well, we can see that as attacks get more sophisticated, that's not enough and it doesn't stop them. Because we haven't done this piece, because we can't explain to leadership the consequences of that decision. Leadership has to be able to have the information given to them in such a way that they can make the best decision. And that's where they're having an issue right now, because all they hear is bad stuff's happening, more bad stuff's going to happen. Gee, boss, you know, it's getting really bad. But until we can quantify it, put it in terms that leadership can use, consume, understand, now they can make decisions, whether it's based on financial risk to the organization or what that risk is. But it has to be quantified, put into those terms so that they can make the decision. Once you've done that successfully, the decision-making becomes very easy. You understand the financial cost of implementing against what the risk is of what you will lose. Make sense? It becomes a very easy ask at that point. Getting there is the difficult part. And I'll say this, in the industry right now, most of the tools that are out there to do this kind of work are either enterprise tools, and it's in the cloud. And I have some strong opinions about putting somebody's vulnerability data in a cloud, but that's where it is right now. That's the state of what it is. Or you have people like me that sit in an organization and know how to do this work, and they turn around and do the work and create the tools. There's a gap in the industry of tools that are easy, fast, inexpensive, that can be put in the hands of anyone within an organization of any size to do this work, to understand, to make that case. And that, in fact, is what my business does, and why I pivoted to doing this work, because when I needed to do it for my client, nuclear regulatory, there were no options, and I had to go build them. And so I totally understand the struggle. I'm very passionate, if you haven't picked up on that, about cybersecurity. And I think most of the people in this field are very passionate, and we care a great deal about the organizations, and we feel the struggle, because even though you're doing everything right and you've got the best practices and your people are doing everything that they can, the risk increases and the bad guys are winning. So absolutely having the right tools is a big part of being able to get the data you need to make that presentation so that leadership can understand what the risk is. And they're never going to want to hear the bad story too, I'll tell you that.
Right, but you know, better to hear it sooner than after the fact, right?
Yes.
So we really, really thank you so much for making a challenging topic, and like you said, one that folks don't want to always spend too much time thinking about, consumable in your presentation. So we appreciate that. Thank you for your time, and we're going to release the participants to run across the hall to their next virtual hall, to their next session. Thank you so much, and all of you have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you. You as well.
Bye.